in-depth academic and personal journeys that students have undergone, and the supervisors with them, and they really represent really significant achievement of 8 months diving deeply into a single topic, and that has its pros and cons, and I hope the pros will continue to shine today as they have so far. Welcome back, Pete and Mariella. So good to see you. Had to spend an extra day in Europe.
Too bad.
They took good care of you. These gowns are probably not the most appropriate things for this particular thesis presentation. It would be better if we had something more like a tunic of St. Francis to wear, because this is a thesis that's not about honor and achievement and success and competition, but about authenticity and spiritual poverty and things that can really make a difference, things that are undervalued and underappreciated in our world. Working on this project with Alannah has been a real privilege, in part because of all the heart that she brings to it and all the insight, but also in part because it's a topic that she chose very close to my heart, so much so that a couple times in messages over the course of the year that I've given at church, I had to be really careful not to plagiarize her. I'm sure if I did it with proper citations and so on. But it has been a very impressive journey, and following the track part and where it was leading in this, and she wanted to do it in a different kind of way as well. She didn't want to do it through intellectual argument, although it is a very intellectually sound thesis, but she wanted to do it by opening up some space for people to hear something new and to touch them in their hearts, and I think she succeeds very well in that. I want to pray a blessing that I think is appropriate for her, so if you could come up beside me, Alannah. So this is a prayer that is, it's a couple prayers from St. Clair, one of the inspirations for your thesis, and it's sandwiched between a couple of Beatitudes. Beatitude sandwich. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. What you hold, may you always hold. What you do, may you always do and never abandon. But with swift pace, light step, and unswerving feet, so that even your steps stir up no dust. Go forward, the Spirit of our God has called you. Live without fear. Your Creator loves you, made you holy, and has always protected you. Follow the good road in peace, and may God's blessing remain with you always. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God.
Thanks for being here. In his writings, Bernard of Clairvaux proposes 4 degrees of love. In the first degree of love, man or woman loves himself for his own sake. In the second degree, man loves God for man's own sake. In the third degree of love, man loves God for God's own sake. But Bernard doesn't stop here. Finally, and perhaps unexpectedly, man learns to love himself for God's sake. When I first heard the 4 degrees of love, I was intrigued. The idea that love of self could actually be the highest form of love made me stop and consider the depth of a genuine love of self. It's often difficult to consider love of self without thinking that it must necessarily accompany ego and self-centeredness, and that it must come from a place of vanity and judgment. Though this can sometimes be true, I believe a genuine love of self is one that grows to become inseparable from love of others. This interdependence of love is what strings together the 3 major themes of this thesis: authenticity, inner poverty, and nonviolence.
The smoke of my own breath, echoes, ripples, buzzed whispers, love root, silk thread, crotch and vine. my respiration and inspiration, the beating of my heart, the passing of blood and air through my lungs, the sniff of green leaves and dry leaves, and of the shore and dark-colored sea rocks, and of hay in the barn, the sound of the belched words of my voice, loosed to the eddies of the wind, a few light kisses, a few embraces, a reaching around of arms, the play of shine and shade on the trees as the supple boughs wag, the delight alone or in the rush of the streets, or along the fields and hillsides, the feeling of health, the full moon trill, the song of me rising from bed and meeting the sun.
Elizabeth O'Connor, one of the inspirations for the topic of this thesis, writes that as individuals we have many selves, and it is in coming to know this complexity, this plurality, that we can learn to embrace our authentic selves. It's important to recognize all of our many selves, the various roles we take on, emotions we experience, actions we choose, thoughts we have. And it is in recognizing that we are plural that will help us do this. For example, as we acknowledge the darkness that's inside us alongside the light, and the light alongside the darkness, we're able to have a clearer picture of ourselves and are walking towards wholeness. Here, O'Connor highlights the tendency we have to look at ourselves in black and white terms, seeing ourselves as either good or bad. But if we can move away from this tendency, we can look at ourselves more truthfully. In the following quote, Elizabeth O'Connor describes a process of self-discovery. She says, "If I respect the plurality in myself and no longer see my jealous self as the whole of me, then I've gained the distance I need to observe it, listen to it, and let it acquaint me with a piece of my own lost history. In this way, I come into possession of more of myself and extend my own inner kingdom. Suppose we come to know that every recognition of anger and jealousy and greed and sloth is an opportunity to lift out of the waters of unconsciousness a tiny piece of submerged land. Then will we not pity the man who is so identified with the good that he denies any intimations from below that this good may not be the whole of him? Unaware that he is cut off from a large part of himself, he does not understand what it means to be on the journey of becoming whole." As I recognize my jealous self and remember that it doesn't make up all of who I am, I necessarily determine that my loving self is also not the whole of me. Sometimes I have trouble saying this. There's a part of me that doesn't want to recognize that I'm more than one. Still, it is dishonest of me to ignore the not-so-nice qualities that are as much a part of me as my compassion, for example. Further, it's dangerous for me to disbelieve the presence of these shadow selves, because it is this denial and therefore disconnect from the whole of who I am that fuels my self-righteousness, hatred, and violence towards myself and others. But if I can look at myself with honesty, seeing my own many selves, I no longer have to see others in black and white. I don't have to see my enemy as fully evil or wrong, even if he or she does terrible things to me. I don't have to see the religious other as solely the embodiment of a different belief than mine. In the same sense, I need not see my friend as always right or always loving. I need not see my mentors or religious leaders as flawless. Seeing the plurality in myself, that is, approaching wholeness and authenticity, helps me to be more gentle and generous towards others as I allow them, in my own understanding of them, to be more than one. Richard Rohr offers an incredibly powerful quote that unveils the very darkest of actions that can come from the refusal to know ourselves. He writes, "One could say that the tragedy, the goat stories of racism, slavery, sexism, the Crusades, the Inquisition, and the 2 World Wars, all of which emerged in and were tolerated by Christian Europe, are a stunning manifestation of our disillusionment and disgust with ourselves and one another, when we could not make the world right and perfectly ordered as we were told it should be. We could not love the imperfection within ourselves or the natural world, so how could we possibly build any bridges towards Jews, Muslims, people of color, women, sinners, or even other Christians? None of them fit into the order we had pre-decided on. We had to kill, force, imprison, torture, and enslave as we pursued our colonization of the rest of the world, along with the planet itself. We did not carry the cross, the tragic sense of life, but we became expert instead at imposing tragedies on others." This is the danger. that we would become so disassociated with our own selves that we act in devastatingly violent ways to keep ourselves deceived about who we are.
If you are willing to serenely bear the trial of being displeasing to yourself, then you will be for Jesus a pleasant place of shelter. St. Therese de Lisieux.
Richard Rohr writes that, quote, suffering does not solve any problem mechanically as much as it reveals the constant problem that we are to ourselves and opens up new spaces within us for learning and loving, unquote. I believe this is what Therese de Lisieux is saying in the quote above. To do this, to bear serenely the trial of being displeasing to yourself, is to choose honesty in the face of our own poverty, embracing it as gift. Honesty and poverty each carries great weight and discomfort. It's after realizing that we need growth that we can grow. And it's precisely this realization that helps us to become more truly caring towards others. And it's by doing this that we can more readily choose nonviolence towards ourselves and others, something that we have for the most part never been good at. Often when we think of the ideal successful individual, we picture someone who's strong, decisive, capable, independent. To speak of weakness, poverty, or fragility brings up feelings of discomfort within us. This is a great tragedy. Seeing our strengths as the only things of value within us often stops us from exploring the weaker parts of ourselves. This separates us from the whole of who we are and keeps safe the metaphorical walls that separate ourselves from others. Jean Vanier, founder of Large Communities, which are intentional communities centered around people with developmental disabilities, insists that weakness is at the core of humanity and is actually the key to genuine relationship with others. He writes, "To be human is to accept who we are, this mixture of strength and weakness. To be human is to accept and love others just as they are. To be human is to be bonded together, each with our weaknesses and strengths, because we need each other. Weakness recognized, accepted, and offered is at the heart of belonging, so it is at the heart of communion with another." Beginning to see our inner poverty in a new light, as a grace rather than a curse, will help us along our journey of self-discovery. Inner poverty is a concept I've struggled with greatly. Christianity as an institution has long used concepts of human sin, darkness, and weakness, with Christ as the absence, destroyer, and overcomer of these as a pillar for its theology, and has often used this theology as a platform for thrusting shame and fear upon human hearts. And it should be noted that a disproportionate amount of this human sin has been attributed to cultures, faiths, and people groups deemed different and unclean by that same institution. It has often painted God as a wrathful and angry deity whose best solution to humanity's issues is to violently destroy humanity and start again, like Noah's Ark. With an example like this to draw from, it is no wonder that we have often resorted and continue to resort to violence when confronted with human darkness, be it in ourselves or others. It's perhaps this foundational idea that evil must be eliminated with violence that causes us to be resistant when confronting our own darkness. If we've been told that evil must be destroyed with violence, what does it mean if we find evil inside ourselves? In the same way, it is these kinds of examples that allow us to justify our own violence towards others. If we can see ourselves as the good ones and the others as the evil ones, anything goes in order to eliminate the other. We perform these acts often in the name of morality and even in the name of God. There are two divergent ways in the Christian faith of viewing the essence of humanity. The first is according to Genesis 1, which reads, quote, "So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them," unquote. It's a favorable view of humankind, one that suggests we are made for goodness. The second view has its focus on Genesis 3, which recounts the fall of humanity. Quote, "To Adam he said, 'Because you listened to your wife and ate fruit from the tree about which I commanded you, you must not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat food from it all the days of your life," unquote. I believe it's an intertwining of these two views that is the most healthy way to approach the human condition. We need the hope that at the core of humanity is goodness, to have the courage to look into our motives and actions, knowing that we are imperfect. It is the interplay, the dance between these two foundational ideas that must be present at the foundation of our communities if they are to be healthy and whole. Either of these theologies without the other is doomed to become an unhealthy belief system. A view that only accepts the goodness of humanity is not honest and encourages shame and conditional love of self, while a view that only sees humanity's mistakes and shortcomings is not hopeful and is also not honest. We can find humility and love for ourselves and others in embracing our own poverty. We can find hope and joy in the trust that we are being remade, that we can continue to become more loving. If we're honest with ourselves, we will discover more and more our own inner poverty. From this discovery, we can move to an embrace of poverty that calls for us to practice it. Practicing poverty is both recognizing my own darkness, needs, and faults, and using these realizations to have genuine encounters with others. Poverty asks of us that we continuously strip away the things that hold us back from others and dismantle the ideologies, structures, and stuffing within us that makes us feel superior to others. I've chosen to primarily use the term poverty in this thesis as opposed to other similar terms because of its use and embrace by both St. Francis and St. Clare of Assisi around 800 years ago. I first came to know the intrinsic meaning and beauty of weakness through the examples of these two revolutionary figures. Francis, beginning his life as part of a wealthy Italian family, was able to see through the excess of wealth, trading it to embrace lady poverty. After having fought for Assisi in a war between towns, Francis was imprisoned and experienced physical and emotional turmoil. It was after this suffering that his heart began to change. He felt a call from God to live as a poor man and rebuild the church, and so renounced his father's wealth, throwing expensive tapestries and materials out the windows. When confronted by his father in court, Francis stripped naked in front of everyone and began to live as a beggar, asking for food as well as stones to rebuild San Damiano, a church found on the same hill as Assisi. Francis's lifestyle and preaching quickly attracted followers, and he eventually began an order that in its beginning took extremely literally the words of Jesus, especially those about poverty.
Until now, I had thought of poverty as the curse of the earth, a fearful mistake in creation, a kind of forgetfulness on the part of God, an inexpressible chaos that swallowed human beings and made them suffer. Now I saw something else. The curse was not in poverty, it was in wealth. It was in power, which hardened and poisoned hearts. Poverty was not creation's mistake, but its last page, perhaps the most important page, the one that placed men and women before mystery and obligated them to seek after God and the supreme gift of self. It was not God's forgetfulness of us, but his true, raw way of digging out of the depths of us free love and naked faith. It was not chaos, clutching at men and women's throats to make them cry out and curse the day they were born, but the motherly lap that would give them birth, bear them into the kingdom. From that moment, I had no more doubts. Poverty was the dwelling place of the divine, the highest school of true love, the mighty pull of mercy, the encounter with God made easy, the surest way to cross this earth. I espoused my lady poverty and desire, and from that moment, all fear died within me. Or rather, true freedom began.
Rather than taking on poverty, literally and spiritually as a burden, Francis accepted it joyfully. He believed it was a means through which to live in peace with others and to follow Jesus' teachings and example. There's an idea that emerges from many writings on the subject of inner poverty that suggests that it is only through the realization and embrace of our own poverty that we can come into true encounter with ourselves. Johannes Metz, in Poverty of Spirit, writes, "Every genuine human encounter must be inspired by poverty of spirit. We must forget ourselves in order to let the other person approach us. We must be able to open up to him, to let his distinctive personality unfold, even though it often frightens or repels us. We often keep the other person down and only see what we want to see. Thus, we never really encounter the mysterious secret of his being, only ourselves. Failing to risk the poverty of encounter, we indulge in a new form of self-assertion and pay a price for it: loneliness. Because we did not risk the poverty of openness, our lives are not graced with the warm fullness of human existence. We are left with only a shadow of our real self. Here we see how much these two encounters, encounter of self with self and encounter of self with other, and how they're dependent on each other. And so it seems the world works in an upside-down sort of way. Through poverty, our lives are enriched.
If you knew yourself for even one moment, if you could just glimpse your most beautiful face, maybe you wouldn't slumber so deeply in that house of clay. Why not move into your house of joy and shine into every crevice? For you are the secret treasure bearer and always have been. Didn't you know?
The final words of St. Clare of Assisi are recorded to have been the following, quote, "Go securely and in peace, my blessed soul. The one who created you and made you holy has always loved you tenderly as a mother her dear child. And you, Lord, are blessed because you have created me." These words to me represent a picture of self-love and acceptance. It was on my own visit to Assisi that I was struck by the idea that poverty could be something of value, so much so that it should be fought for. Claire, born into a wealthy family, heard Francis preaching and at 18 years of age fled from her home to join him. She began a new religious order today called the Poor Clares. In founding this order, Claire wanted to make sure that the sisters would be able to live in poverty without needing to own property, and so petitioned the Pope with a letter entitled The Privilege of Poverty. In her book, The Privilege of Poverty, Joan Mueller writes on Claire's motivation for insistence on poverty. She explains, quote, "Their choice of poverty was a decision not to become entangled in the endemic warfare and litigation that affected all who owned property and asserted their rights, even monasteries of nuns. Claire and Agnes wanted peace, and they were willing to give up everything in order to have this peace." St. Francis of Assisi once said, quote, "If we have any possessions, we should need weapons and laws to defend them," unquote. This is an important clue into the relationship between concepts of authenticity, inner poverty, and nonviolence. Francis wrote in his rule, quote, "Wherever the brothers may be, either in hermitages or other places, let them be careful not to make any place their own or contend with anyone for it. Whoever comes to them, friend or foe, thief or robber, let him be received with kindness," unquote. This line gives us insight into one of the most important fruits of poverty, peace. Indeed, not indeed. As I've shown previously, an important aspect of authenticity is the dismantling of structures inside ourselves that separate us from those around us and keep hidden the truth about ourselves. These structures, pride, unhealthy identity, self-image, etc., I believe belong in the category of possessions of which Francis speaks, which fuel violence through a need to defend them. It is through the practice and embrace of inner poverty, then, that nonviolence grows. Furthermore, it is in the spirit of honesty, authenticity, and inner poverty that we become more aware of the ways in which we already contribute to violence. Authenticity is recognizing the structures within ourselves that are not so healthy, along with the ones that are, that make for harming others and those that help others, and that lead us to think about others in demeaning and hateful ways that often lead to violence, or loving ways that lead to compassion. Authenticity is also recognizing the unjust structures that I am a part of that encourage violence and create suffering. In Peacemaking, a community workbook, Matt Balcaris explains that, quote, "Peacemaking requires honesty about complicity." He writes, "It is hard to admit because we like the idea that we are only responsible for those things we clearly choose. But we can never live in peace if we do not see ourselves as participating in the unhealthy conflict that hurts us and the world we live in. We are embedded in it. taking together the inevitability of conflict, along with our limited capacity to live without coercion and the relational web of our existence, we can see that in order to be peacemakers, we must admit that our ways of living damage other people. And even though this damage is sometimes unintentional, it is not excusable. Accepting the part we play in violence can be painful. I believe that a more favorable understanding of inner poverty can give us strength and courage to examine our actions.
The unseen violence in our story is this. We directly benefit from the actions others have taken in exploiting the land and resources of First Nations people. The unseen violence in our story is this. We directly benefit from the actions others have taken using military force against other nations and people, including civilians. The unseen violence in our story is this. We directly benefit from the modern slavery created by the exploitation of people in the developing world who produce our cheap consumer products. The unseen violence in our story is this. We directly benefit from the wanton destruction of the world created by God to be our home.
Realizing the part we play in violence and the ways that we benefit from injustice further deepens our understanding of our inner selves, of our many selves, and our own inner poverty. This is an important example of truth-telling. Balkeras also explains that the importance of bringing this unseen violence into the open is so that conversation can begin to happen about possible ways forward to create a more peaceful world, but also just because it's more honest. By accepting the truth about myself and my actions, I am moving towards a more honest and whole life. Though painful, it is important that I see the impact of my own choices. For example, I need to understand that many of the clothes I buy are made by workers in developing countries who are often underpaid and working in unsafe factory environments. Once I understand this impact, I can let it hurt me and let it change me. I can let it illuminate my darkness, broaden my understanding, and deepen my love. For honesty's sake, I need to see my own desire for material gain and how I sometimes place it above the well-being of the world's most vulnerable. This is the tension that, should I choose to bear it, will transform me. In a video called Love Your Enemy, made by the Work of the People, Miroslav Volf says that it's, quote, "It's tough for people with power to love their enemies," unquote. Instead, the concept of love of enemy, he explains, actually, quote, emerged from marginalized groups. It is they that have radical love. He says the position of marginality often lets you have an insight into the true character of human relations, and being at the center and being powerful at the center, and normally the two go together, blinds you from certain things so that you can have eyes but not see and ears but not hear. And the standing privilege of those who are powerless may be significant here. This idea of loving one's enemy emerged, as it has, in the situation of marginality. It would seem that those who have experienced oppression and hardship have a greater capacity for compassion towards others. In the book From Suffering to Solidarity, which maps out important aspects and themes within, quote, Mennonite interreligious, interethnic, and international peace building, quote, describes a concept that goes hand in hand with what Volf is saying. Andrew Klager, in the introduction of the book, introduces the term empathetic solidarity, which is essentially being able to draw on one's own experiences of suffering in order to empathize, care for, and work nonviolently towards justice for others. He argues that this is what Mennonites have done. These two ideas, that the concept of love of enemy came from groups of marginalized people, and the concept of empathetic solidarity, demonstrate the importance of humility and an embrace of inner poverty to peace building and nonviolence. It's by recognizing and feeling our own pain that we can empathize with the pain of others, enemy or not. It's also through this pain that we can choose to act more and more nonviolently towards others, so as not to be a part of the cause of their pain. As we practice authenticity and the embrace of inner poverty, we begin to see ourselves in all others, recognizing that we are all dependent beings with important faults and incredible potential for good. In doing so, it becomes harder to separate our violence from its consequences and to see the actions of others without considering that they are whole people who are broken and sometimes make bad decisions just like us. This is precisely why it is so important for us to put the work into loving ourselves more and more genuinely. If we can honestly recognize the scope of our own inner poverty, of our violent actions, of our darkness, while continuing to love ourselves through these realizations, knowing that we are much more complicated than simply good or bad, we can love our enemies when they come at us with hurtful words and violent actions. We can love those who do wrong just like us, seeing the humanity in them just as we recognize it in ourselves. It feels both obvious and a little redundant to say that there is much injustice, pain, and violence in our world. The weight of it all is heavy, and we are left with the question, what can we do? While this thesis is not an exhaustive response to the question, it represents, I think, a good starting place. What can we do when faced with the gravity of our violent world? We can love ourselves. Taking an honest look at ourselves is our most accessible key to compassion and care for others. While we are each vastly unique, we all carry within ourselves the beauty and the darkness of humanity. And by looking honestly at ourselves, we are able to recognize our deep connection with all others. It is this connection and a fierce love for ourselves that overflows into love for all, that gives us the courage to look at ourselves honestly and make changes to live more gently in the world. Indeed, our own authenticity, our own choice to be vulnerable, to see our weaknesses and to embrace them is an incredible tool in cultivating compassion and living more and more nonviolently. To begin a journey like this is a difficult and brave choice that will be filled with even more difficult and brave choices. And yet, I believe that this journey is also filled with grace and bursting with joy.
I celebrate myself and sing myself. And what I assume, you shall assume. For every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you, I loaf and invite my soul. I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a spirit of summer grass. My tongue, every atom of my blood, formed from this soil, this air, born here of parents, born here from parents the same, and their parents the same. I, now 37 years old, in perfect health, begin, hoping to cease, not till death. Walt Whitman, song of myself.
Thank you.
Being more restrained than Sarah and Emily, we did a little less huzzahing. To say amen. This is a great chance to interact with these great ideas. I can't believe how touched I am to hear your words after reading them. We're going to do an experiment. We're going to try passing around a cordless mic for those asking questions so that everyone can hear the questions too. So don't let that intimidate you. If you want to ask a question, you really not want a mic, do it. Just, love yourself and belt it out there. But let's hear some questions. Emily?
First I just want to point out that we're roommates.
And we really haven't talked about our theses with each other, so it's cool that we both brought it back to the individual at the end. I had no idea you were going to do that. So, my question is, I was wondering if you could share a little bit about what this thesis has meant for you personally. Being your roommate.
It's been really difficult. Yeah, I've come to this. I really like the idea of nonviolence, and so I came to that. Yeah, through some courses at SSU and really wanted to explore it. I was hoping that writing this thesis would be like this year of transformation, and I would come out just like amazing, and that I would just like everything would be good. But I realized that I have a lot of work to do still. Yeah. So. Yeah.
I know that in today there's a lot of youth that struggle with loving themselves, and I just want to hear like what your thoughts are on that and how we can support youth to like learn what loving yourself means.
Yeah. I mean, through this whole thesis, I'm talking about love of self not as a singular thing, but as something that's connected to everything else in life. I think, if we only have love for ourselves, I would argue that's not a genuine love for ourselves. And so I think to encourage people to do that, it's this whole circular thing, but I would start with relationship. Just like trying to get to know people, and to get to know yourself. And through that, I mean, one of the major things that we need to learn to love ourselves is to know that other people love us. So if we can show love to other people, that's a good first step.
Alannah, could you just elaborate a little bit on Assisi, your experience there, what that meant to you, how it apparently has been a formative part of this whole project?
Yeah. So before I went to Assisi, I was already a big fan of St. Francis. But something that really struck me actually is I had more of an emotional experience visiting where St. Clair's body was. And so basically you go down into the church and they have these panels on the walls and they have her body there. And then the panels on the walls kind of show some of the stories of her life. And something that really stuck out to me is how determined she was. So like nobody wanted her to leave. Her family, like she snuck away from her family. She was betrothed to be married and, to further her family's wealth, and instead she snuck out and ran and met St. Francis and a few other of the brothers and, cut all her hair off. And, but she was so determined against, everything her family was saying. She was so captivated by the poverty that Francis was preaching. And that really stuck out to me. That really touched me. There was something there.
I have a lot to say, but I'll probably cry because I'm so proud of you. I just was thinking of the impact of shame in our culture, and you're talking about shame coming from a lot of church culture, and I don't really know the question here, but there's something I'm thinking about, maybe in relation to Emily's talking about globalization, but learning from other cultures and especially other places where poverty and the church meet. Because I think a lot of what I understand about shame, of course, is coming from my Western
experience in church culture, my evangelical growing up in a Western culture. And not to say there's not healing coming from this side of the world, and I don't know if you looked at that at all, but I'm just, honestly, I was thinking of you on the streets of Malaysia years ago having these conversations, and just thinking about, talking about poverty and shame in outside of the Western context changes that conversation a little bit. But in a hopeful way, I think there are other cultural and church cultural realities we can look at where shame is not as prevalent, I hope. But I just wonder that's kind of a collection of thoughts, but I just wonder this idea of shame connected to our culture. Do you see that changing? Do you see other things coming in to help us find a healthier way of engaging, especially in the church, maybe with this idea?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, what I'm talking about here, you know, I talk about how, I mean, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit," and we forget that. Yeah. So I hope that it can change.
Do you feel that there is a general, maybe an upcoming sense of I don't know what the word is, dissatisfaction with North American Christianity in that sense? You feel that's a coming movement?
I mean, this community is very, I think we have some values that are opposed to that. And so that kind of changes the way I see things too. I don't know how to answer that. I mean, it was something like 80% of evangelical Christians voted for Donald Trump. I don't know. I really hope so. I really hope that there can be change. Yeah.
How do you think that could start? Conversation, relationships?
Yeah. Yeah, I do.
Just talking?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can start with that. I think it can start with also just being honest with ourselves too. Like starting to look at ourselves and who we are. Because a lot of what I'm talking about, you know, these ideas of like build a wall, keep other people away, they can be combated with actually embracing poverty and seeing it in ourselves, seeing ourselves as people who need each other, who are in need, and then being able to see other people in that way too. Yeah.
Alannah, this isn't a question, but a really powerful, for me, thing that you said from the beginning was that we are plural selves. There's a whole plurality of ourselves, and I think taking that and living with that and beginning to notice some of those different voices that are part of who we are. Maybe it's a way of being compassionate, first with ourselves. And maybe that's a step away from shame, where, you know, maybe shame is based on so much it's black and white, you know? And yeah, that was a really powerful thing that you talked about for me, the plurality of ourselves.
Yeah, and something that O'Connor, the author who has come up with this idea, she even says, like, if we can recognize that there are many selves within us, we can also then take a step back and look at them and see which ones are influencing us. And we can make, we can make choices on which selves we're listening to, if we can recognize that we have many, if we can recognize that we're not just the one voice that we're hearing, we're not just one thing.
Hey, thank you so much, first of all. Like that, your message is definitely, I felt like my heart like softening and breaking in the best sort of way, so thank you. That was, yeah, wow. So you're speaking about nonviolence and how this self-love feeds into a culture that is nonviolent. How would you say, in what you've been looking into through this thesis, like what would be a good way to respond to violence? Like if someone commits violence against you or other people, like the kind of, how does justice fit into this? Like we all, yeah.
I heard someone say once that it's good to consider, for example, you might say, like, what do you do if someone breaks into your house, for example? How do you respond to that? Someone has responded saying, how would you respond if it was your brother who was breaking into your house? If it was your father who was breaking into your house? Would you respond differently than you would if it was a complete stranger? And I think that that's a good place to start. I am not in a place where I can say in every situation the best thing to do is to say these words or to do these things. But if we can get to a point where we can see the dignity in every human being, we can start to live more and more non-violently.
First off, yay, you did it.
Not really that quad. Alannah, congratulations. It's just been so cool. For those of you that don't know, Alannah and I went to church together and were friends together long before we came to SSU. So, like, seeing you choose this topic and, like, also having you explain it beforehand and being like, it's kind of like loving people and stuff, and your brother and stuff. And it was really cool because I was like, well, I guess we'll see in April and like see what it's about. So to see this topic kind of always, like it's always been residing in you. You've always been an amazing friend and just like someone who genuinely loves people and a mediator. So it's been amazing to see that come of you in these 4 years and to see it come to this and just like about your thesis, like how do you maybe this is too much to ask right away because you just finished it. You probably don't want to do it anymore right now, but like, into the future and with your job this summer, how do you feel about where that's taking you and how this prepares you for that or if it does or yeah?
I mean, it's funny, this year I've actually realized how much of a hard time I have loving myself, sometimes. And so I think that for me, this is the logical next step, is to really work through these ideas in myself. Yeah, and trying to relate that to, like, what do I really believe about myself? What do I really believe about other people? And how can I make that better? Otherwise I think that these ideas will be swimming in my mind for a long time.
That, I mean, it was beautiful, a beautiful presentation, and great to see how the presentation reflected so much the journey that you've been on and continue to be on, so thanks for that. Now, I'm trying to think the best way to express this, but I wonder if there's a danger in treating the church as the other, like seeing the church, like is there a chance that the church as the bride of Christ, as if we think of the church as the bride of Christ, that we're doing the exact thing to the church that we're wrestling with in ourselves? It's so easy to look at the flaws in the church, but also to know that there is in the church also much goodness and much light. So I was thinking of this piece that you had asked me to read, which I think is intended to be a message to us as individuals, but if I read it again and think of it as a message to the church, okay, so listen to it that way. If you knew yourself for even one moment, if you could just glimpse your most beautiful face, maybe you wouldn't slumber so deeply in that house of clay. Why not move into your house of joy and shine into every crevice? For you are the secret treasure bearer and always have been. Didn't you know? So I think just the idea of the church, like, you know, I think the church needs to be redeemed, but there's hope. And setting the church up as the enemy of good, I don't think is helpful. But
no, I think you're right.
Great comment.
Great comment from a Sufi poet, whose wisdom wouldn't be allowed in some churches, but nevertheless. I'm just taken by the beauty of your presentation too. Thank you so much. And I, like others, I can see that it's an authentic life struggle. And I think what you've done is, in my mind, I felt almost like people that used to pan for gold. You know, it's like you were going into your education and into life and into everything to try to find the best way forward and to find the gold. And it seems to me that what you've done is you've identified different ways, false ways of loving self, and better ways of loving self. And you know, one false way of loving self would be to love self not in interdependence with others. You map that out so clearly, and to love self not in honesty, not without realization of the shadow, the darker part. That, you know, but learning how to love ourselves with the whole of ourselves, so that we can be healed, and to do it in such a way that is in interdependence. I mean, Jenna's question. So many young people who are not yet invited into this kind of interdependence, a swirl of life, you know, but feel like alienated from it and hurting. If we can only figure out how to help people choose life. But we have just come from San Damiano and Claire's chapel this week, and I'm full of stories about Claire again, and so it was nice to hear you know, using all of these treasured people in history. And Claire, at one point, an army was coming to ravage all of the people in her convent, and she was sick and paralyzed at the time, but she got the sisters to carry her out in front of the oncoming army, and the strength of her prayers and her personality turned them back. So I thought, what a beautiful picture of love of self, that she's strong enough to come into the moment, but she does it without bazookas, you know. She does it with the strength of who God has formed her to be. So anyway, it's just a comment. Thanks so much. It was amazing.
One last thing. There's a lot of young people, potential young business leaders coming up in the future. What would you say to them as they're starting businesses? Some may be involved. I personally own a business that buys from Asia and sells to North America. How can we practically take what you said and put it into practice in today and into the future, building the economy? What approach can we take? Maybe not, I'm not looking for the answer, but how can we change?
On the world, even just with the things that I buy. I think in terms of like piecing this together in our mind, sometimes it's even hard for us to really understand the fullness of our actions. You know, like to really be able to associate, like the gold in my ring was taken from a mine, you know, in Guatemala with poor mining conditions, and it's destroying the environment and this and this and this, and it's even we don't want to think about it. And so like even just the first step is to think about it, and if we can realize, you know, with this plurality of selves that O'Connor's talking about, if we can realize that, you know, if we do bad things, we're not bad people completely, you know? We're not all of one thing. We don't have to be completely compassionate or completely evil or completely these things. And if we can accept that, then we can start looking at these little pieces that we really need to start looking at. Yeah. Did that answer your question?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an ongoing answer to that question.
Yeah, and that's only the first step.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also love that what you said at the end, or your response to Emily's, or I can't remember who asked about how this works, how this is working out for you personally. But it does parallel exactly what you were saying at the end of the thesis, that it's the start of, you know, like long hard work that will lead to more like hard but like beneficial work. Like it keeps opening new doors to continue to enter into the potential and the goodness of your own spirit. So so maybe I just wanted to say that yes, I see that in you, and this is an amazing celebration of that. One step on the way for you. Yeah, thank you.
And what's really important in that is actually community, like being able, like we can't do any of these things alone. And so if we can have a group of people who are willing to start these conversations and work together to make these decisions, I think change can really happen.
Last question to your mom.
First of all, I just want to say how proud I am. What a wonderful presentation. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your journey, and thank you for sharing your findings in this thesis and in this journey. It's amazing. It's been a privilege to walk through some of this with you personally, and to see some of you struggling internally with what you've been reading and what you've been challenged with. And it's been a privilege to see you challenge others in ways that maybe they don't want to, me personally, want to go there, right? To deal with that section of self that we'd rather just put in a closet and leave and everything's good. Thank you. I guess my question would be to you, with the job that you've been gifted with for the summer, and as long as you choose to have this until opportunity comes or whatever, how will you bring your learnings into this next environment? I guess I'm expounding on what Silas asked earlier. How do you feel you could be of importance, or of bringing this into where you're at in your position?
And what job are you doing? I am working for MCC in Moncton. I will be their youth facilitator. I mean, MCC is, as far as I've seen, is already an organization that takes a lot of these things into account. And so I'm really excited to be working for them. But yeah, I think like in terms of just little decisions, like this is something anybody can do in any job. Like, where are the snacks you're buying coming from? And where are, you know, like what are all these, like in what little ways can we change the impact that we have on the world? That's like in a really practical sense. And then in more of a philosophical sense, just continuing to remember that other people are complex just as I am. Yeah, and to affirm that in other people.
Imagine, so this is what I feel left with, like imagine looking at the beauty and the mess in ourselves and feeling love instead of shame. And then imagine looking at the beauty and mess in other people and loving instead of shaming.